And we'll look forward to hearing. And before I get you started there, I just want to point out for all you people watching, this is being recorded. He is recording it, and also he has sent me the PDF of all his slides. So if you would like those slides afterwards, please just send an email and I'll forward it on to you. So there you go, Etienne. Take it away.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So I've actually kept bees now for about 10 years. So 7 years up in the Yukon and about 3 in Northwestern Ontario. Northwestern Ontario was actually easy because it was nice and warm in the summers, and there was flowers everywhere. And I guess there are challenges up in the Yukon, and I guess just from listening to what was going on with the dead hives and your climate, I guess we had a very similar summer. Probably a scale down cooler, but it was really wet and the patterns were really off. And you'll see I'm a fairly data-driven beekeeper or bee geek. And the background is engineering, mostly education now and training and mentoring. So I have I guess I like to understand why. I'm a why beekeeper versus what do I need to do? I guess an advantage or disadvantage is when I moved to the Yukon, there was a couple of old timers who kept bees, but they weren't into social media or presenting or teaching and coaching. So a lot of it was learn as we go. Luckily, I had a few years of experience under my belt, so it wasn't too bad. But what I'll do is I'll get going. I can't see the chat, so if you do have questions, if you really want to ask something, you can just jump in and ask your question, or we can do it at the end. So I'll talk for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions. One of my projects this winter is I've got a single brood hive and a double brood hive and a nook set up with a bunch of sensors. And I guess I'm calculating heat loss and movement of the cluster and different things. And luckily I was able to get some data for some wooden hives down in the US from a few years back. So I'm just doing some comparisons just to see how different it is. In my climate, we have to insulate our hives or they won't survive. So yeah, I'll get going because I can talk a lot about bees. More people than moose in the Yukon. So there's about 80,000 moose up here. Whitehorse, I'm about 40 kilometers from Whitehorse. But my climate is about 40% cooler or colder than Whitehorse, especially in the winter. So we're in a subarctic, typically dry climate. I guess this year, La Nina, I guess a lot of rain, wet, a lot of Alaska, Gulf of Alaska type weather. So it's been really weird. We're very forage limited up here. So most areas can't have more than 2 to 4 hives. If there's been a forest fire, then you can have 40, 50 hives as you want because the fireweed will be crazy and it's really, really good. There's only about 150 to 200 hives up in the Yukon. Success over winters, around 75%, 50 to 75, depending on experience. We're not big honey producers because most of us are just small-time beekeepers. And we're non-regulated, so there's no government rules. So basically it's the Wild West. So we have to self-regulate. And one reason I started my beekeeping group and started a pseudo club up here was to get people educated on the basics so they can identify some diseases, help manage mites. Nosema is a big problem up here. Even chalk brood and EFB. So I've taken it upon myself to educate myself and educate others on the importance of self-managing, or else we'll destroy the native pollinators if we're not careful. So my bees, I actually have 3 yards now, and I keep 2 to 4 hives in each of the yards. And I've got these brood minders and things in all the different yards. The furthest yard is probably 30 kilometers away. And the next one's about 15 kilometers from my home yard. And they all have different patterns. And I guess the forage is interesting. It's close, but one of the yards is blessed with non-native plants. So, and it's closer to a small town called Carcross and some big lakes. So it's a really nice microclimate. And I'll go into some details about that in a bit. Most of my bees come from the Fraser Valley. I haven't bought bees now in I think 3 years. I buy queens here and there, and I raise my own queens up here. Other than one bad year, I usually get most of my hives through. So I might lose one in late spring because of nosema and the bees just don't recover. I'm discovering that mites up here tend to be on a 3-year cycle where they actually reach that point where they become an issue, because I typically try alcohol washes, they always come back to 0, but then I've got an OAV kit, so I run that, and then I get some drops. I get 10 drops, 5 drops. So that's how I measure my mite levels, is actually with a treatment, because the washes just come back 0. I've watched all of Randy Oliver's videos. I've tried different areas of the brood and just off the brood, and I'll cover that in a bit in a couple of slides. So I do use polystyrene hives. It just saves on having to insulate. And I'll show you a slide a bit later, but my evenings, even in the summer, are usually from 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. So they're really cool nights. So having the poly just helps with preventing the nest from getting, I guess, frozen. And my cluster in winter doesn't really happen until about -10, -15. So that's why I like my polys, is I don't have to worry about the nights, and my day highs are in the 20, 25 centigrade range, so which is good weather. So I typically start these sessions with basically stats. One thing I've started up here is I run a winter survival survey with Yukon, Alaska, Northern BC, and NWT beekeepers, just to see how we did over winter. And there's a bit of management practices in there. And then I share it with the group. I put it on my website. And then I see what we're doing, what we're not doing, who was successful, who wasn't. In Alaska, they're all big on Russian queens. But if you look at the stats, the folks with Carniolan queens always seem to do much better than the Russians. I'm not sure why. I have a feeling it has to do with practices more than anything. Folks with mutts or Carniolan just seem to do better up here than with specialty queens, because they're looking for magic bullets. So one thing I do recommend is for clubs and association to run simple surveys for their groups, because it's a good way of sharing information, and then it's a really nice topic for somebody to do in the spring or late spring. And you can use Google Forms and stuff. If you do want an example, I could forward it to you, but it's just a super easy way of collecting data. And so are you doing better than your regional average, so BC? And it should say, do you know how to access the data? So in the US, they have BIP, which is a great database. And there's a lot of insight in their database also. So just a quick example. A lot of people up here or in Alberta and a lot of different places. They think wintering indoors is the magic bullet, but if you actually look at the Kappa stats, the losses are higher indoors, because I think the technique and the approach is a lot more finicky, and you really, really need to know what you're doing. Versus outdoors is fairly straightforward, and once you get your tricks and your approach down pat, it becomes really important. One thing I did discover is, yes, the polyhives insulation is all great, but nutrition, especially fall nutrition, for me was the biggest aha. And the biggest thing that I went from a overwintered cluster of, say, 4 to 6 frames in a double that I have to bring down to a single in the early spring, to now my boxes are in the 12 to 18 frames in March. It's just crazy. By having that, now the issue is mites are becoming more of an issue, because there's a lot more bees in those boxes. So I guess and the brood rearing starts, sometimes I start seeing evidence of some brood rearing in January, late January, early February. And then it really gets going in March. And I'll show you what I do to get the brood rearing going. I do it on purpose. In poly hives, I don't have to worry about starvation, because I feed in fall to make sure they have plenty to get into until June. So, and just to put things in perspective, my hives consume, a double will consume about 50 pounds from late September to April, late April, where in the southern US or even southern Canada, they'll consume as much as that or more in probably a month or two less than what I have up here. So we'll cover that. And you'll notice that I'll just get my pointer going. Where's my mouse? That's the problem with, there we go. Pointer options, laser pointer. So you'll see the different provinces and the reasons they give. You'll see weather, starvation, weak colonies. Sometimes you see poor queen. A lot of the reasons, Varroa, they're all, I would say, beekeeper. It's the beekeeper. So weather, you need to prepare for the weather. You know what it is. So I'll share with in a couple of slides your climate. So I made myself a little tool that pulls the data from a website and pretty much makes a bunch of measures for different bee climate. So I used, I think it's bulletin 11111, I think, from BC on forage behaviors. And it has all these temperature triggers for the different bee behaviors. And then I translated that into weather data. But you'll see that the sooner we own our bees dying, either because we don't know, or so the one thing I do also recommend, I got lucky there, and I bought myself a microscope not too long ago, or a couple of years ago, when I had a bunch of hives die from nosema, but I wanted to make sure. So having a microscope either within a club, or if you had a person or a kid at home that had one in biology class or something, or even talking to the biology teacher at the nearby high school to see if they want any science projects, and you send them samples to do nosema checks, and you teach the kids how to do nosema checks. It's actually quite easy, and they can learn about statistics and basic biology and fungi and stuff like that. So it's actually a nice project for science fair. So keep going. These are just examples of, I think, last year's boxes. I had eight hives going into winter. One of them was a 5-frame nook. We had about 2 weeks, actually more than that, about 6 weeks of between -30 and -50, and they all made it through. I did indicate a couple of the hives here. So this one looked really great in March, but I did notice a lot of mortality over winter out front because the bees in a cold climate, they just drop right in front of the hive. So I had big piles of dead bees. Still a good population, small brood nest. The queen was still there. I test my dead bees in winter, and basically they had some pretty high nosema counts. I do my own way, and I'll show you what I do. But it was a really healthy population. So early March, I throw on my first half pollen patty, and that gets the brood rearing going if it hasn't really started. I first make sure that there's enough honey left in the box, and then I close them up for a couple of weeks, and then I just let them do what they have to do. But you can see these are early March, and in early March, April, the boxes are full of bees, and they explode and they're great, but I still have issues. So usually this was like a crazy hive that overwintered with, I think it came out with 18 frame of bees, and that's 2 doubles. If I flipped it over, looked underneath, the bees were going all the way down. And what happened there is by mid-June, I got complacent. I didn't do my my mite checks. And then I started seeing signs of viruses. I think it was the acute paralysis bee virus. They looked like bees were being poisoned upside down. It coincided with the death camas blooms going on in the bush, which is poisonous for the bees. But then after looking in the box and actually looking at my the drops and doing an OAV, I quickly found out that no, it's mites and I've got to do something about it. It did recover, but it's overwintering as a single, and it's in my sick pile of hives. I have 2 hives that I'm testing to see if they'll survive the winter. One had chalk brood and didn't really do well, and then the other one had lots of mites. So I treated it like, I don't know, 5-10 times over from August to September, and the drops were always high. And we're talking hundreds of, when you do an OAV, say 500 to 1,000 mites here and there. So it was massively infected. One thing I recommend new beekeepers is take pictures and rename your pictures with dates and hive numbers, because it's really useful for looking back. I'm not good at taking hand notes, but I take a lot of pictures. So early spring, usually the first warm weather of March, if we get a warm spell, I'll check for brood really quick. The stores, if it's a weak hive, I'll shrink it down to a single or nook. I have some poly nooks. I just like having really nice condensed hives in the spring. I add a pollen patty or a half pollen patty, and then I keep it quick and close it up and let them go again. So I'll speed things up. So this is just about beekeepers learning how to do postmortems on their hives and to look for signs and evidence of what the issues are. I also do reliability engineering in my professional work. And most of the issues with industry and with businesses is people. It's people management, and it's how we do things. So I tend to focus on that, and the bees is not the problem, I'm the problem. So some basics on hive management. So when new beekeepers start here, one thing I do ask is, why do you want to keep bees? What are your goals? Is it just to keep bees? Do you want to make honey? One thing I was never able to do is we have 2 nectar flows here. We have a mid-June flow, and then a mid to late July flow, and that's the fireweed flow. Never thought the June flow would be possible, but now with my big boxes, I can set it up so that I have a couple of hives or half my hives going for the June flow, and then those other hives I'm splitting to make my replacements. but then they'll be in a position to get into the July flow. So I manage my hives to maximize my honey production. Are your hives always weak in the spring? So is it really slow to start? So do you want to collect pollen, propolis, and other hive products? I'll show you, I do collect pollen, but it's like 6 hours every 2 weeks. And I just want to know what's coming into those hives and how multifloral or polyfloral, the multicolors of the pollen coming in is really critical for me. Because in late July, it's pretty much just dark green pollen coming from the fireweed, and it's a unifloral type pollen. It's a good pollen, but it's not enough. So I tend to start feeding my pollen patties late July, and it's to make sure that my winter bees are in a good, they get raised properly and have a healthy diet. And then different reasons. So I think everybody's goal should be at least 90% winter survival, and it is doable. I like Randy Oliver's expression, he's treatment free until he has to treat. And I guess I follow the same thing. So this is very calendar based. A lot of beekeepers like having cookie cutter, this is how I beekeep. But I try to make sure they understand why we do things versus you need to do this. Because if they don't understand the trigger points, that's where things could happen. So most of my inspections now are about 5 minutes. I do maybe 2 big inspections a year. I do one in the spring to do my cleanup, and then I'll do another one in late summer to see how they're doing for winter readiness. And if it's a swarmy hive that's just blowing up, then I might do a few more to manage the swarming. But in general, I take 1 or 2 frames, maybe max 4 frames, and I look for, I guess, the brood position. One thing with polys is they actually brood up right to the position 0 and 9. So a lot of times you'll find brood on that side frame. Look for eggs. If I'm lucky, I'll see the queen, but I don't really care about finding the queen. I tend to do a lot of tilt test just to see how the hive is doing. Because I'll show you my weight curves, and the issue up here with a marginal hive that's just starting up is they don't have the forager force to really bring in what they need to maintain their weight. So the weights tend to drop in between nectar flows. Bottom boards, so all my hives have screen bottom boards. Even the wintered hive out here, I've got a crawl space underneath the hive so that the wind can't blow underneath, but it's just full of snow right now. And my screen bottom boards are wide open. And it helps with the moisture drains down. But in these bottom boards, it's really easy to look for chalk brood because you'll see the mummies down there. You'll see the progression, the growth of the hive, like fresh whitish, yellowish wax, the cappings from bees hatching. Sometimes you see little larvae of different things. When you do your OAV, you can actually see, did you kill any mites? How many did you kill? And if you're consistent and you do it every time, then it's really good. We usually have, I guess, polys rarely up here. I've seen bearding on one of my hives once. So tray in or tray out. Polys actually help keep the sun heat out. So even if we had 30 degrees out, the insulation actually helps keep the hive cool. So I'm not too worried about overheating. But these bottom boards, sometimes I pull them out in the warmer times, and I put them in maybe two days before an inspection. So one critical thing for spring is to make sure your queen is performing. I hate using the word performing, but up here, I don't leave it up to guesswork anymore, but the first big cleanup, usually early April, mid-April, I'll do a brood check. The first brood check is just I'll put a pollen patty to see if just to trigger and to make sure the queen will start laying if she is there. So by the time I go in April, if I don't see any eggs, then I know the queen's not there or she's not going to be a performer. So then I just call Winston up at BC Bee Supply and say, send me a queen. And if there is brood, then basically if there's more than 6 frames of bees and even brood in a double, then chances are they'll be fine. If I have some really strong hives, I'll just steal some resources from there and boost a weaker hive. But the first one is just to get a first snapshot. Then a couple weeks later, I'll go back and I'll count the frame of bees. Okay, and then a couple weeks after that, I'll go and do a third assessment. So basically, if the hive's dwindled after the second assessment, chances are that hive's not going to make it. So I'll probably either combine it, throw it in a nook, and then buy a fresh queen. But the goal is you're looking for steady growth, still good. If it's at the same number or less, then you've got to requeen. And if you don't, that hive's going to dwindle and not go anywhere. And one thing I've had to learn is to know when to quit. I've tried babying and getting hives back from the brink. I've done it a few times, but it just requires so much time and effort. So now I just know when to quit and say goodbye. One thing when you're using polys is, and even wooden hives, is what's critical is the number of bees to the volume. In an insulated hive, you can go smaller. So like I said, I've had 5 frame nooks over winter, like last winter, in basically extremely cold weather. It was positioned in a way between 2 singles, and they all made it through. But I'd say too few bees in a big volume is a recipe for a dying hive. So I guess I talked a bit more than I wanted. So nectar flows. Hopefully you know when your nectar flows are in your area, and in between nectar flows, if your hive goes downhill, you need to do something. This last summer was really wet, and we were getting a lot of non-flying days. So I had to feed, especially in June and July, or else those hives would dwindle to nothing. So the June flow last year was really, really good. So luckily I was able to, I don't know, make maybe 50 pounds of June honey per hive surplus. So it gave me a nice buffer. But July didn't go anywhere, and basically first frost was late. I think it was late July last year. So it was a really crappy summer. We get a lot of honeydew up here. So if you do have some, learn to identify it, because it's not a good honey to use for overwintering. It's actually quite good if you learn to enjoy it, and it's got some nice medicinal properties. So I'll skip this. So it's habitat loss, overcrowding, so too many hives in one area. So we don't have pesticides up here, and bees are non-native up here. It's honeybees, so the climate change is really not an issue for the honeybees. The winter, and for the bumblebees and the wasps and stuff, you can see it's messing up their cycles, because we're warming up here more, I guess, faster than a lot of different places. Bought a pollen collector on Amazon for $20-some, and I collect over the beekeeping season, and then in the winter I do some microscopy to see where they're coming from. but just looking at the different colors. And we walk our dog a lot, so on the walks I take notes of what's flowering, if there's bees on them, and I actually put it here, so it's all pretty much there. And a bunch of us have had our honey tested with Peter at True Honey Buzz, and I guess there's some unique flowers in the Yukon with some interesting sugar signatures that aren't seen anywhere else. So I'll just skip that. So for me up here, I need to use pollen patties in the fall and in early spring because our season's so short. So I need those queens to start early so that I can do my splits and I can be in a position to get my honey. So you can see if your 35 degrees Celsius is the temperature of the brood nest where you know they're laying, and then usually this is the bad one this year. My other hives, they went to mid-August to September before this dwindle. So once I noticed this, I think I did put pollen patties here, but I didn't replenish them. And you can see how the temperature goes down. So the queen's slowing down. I add pollen patties, the temperature increases again. And every time I've added pollen patties, the temperature goes back up. If I look at it, you can see the queen does another round of egg laying, but it's not good because it's not consistent. So the brood raised in this fluctuating temperature. You can see 35 is perfect. 33 is probably the borderline of what you're looking for. And below that, the bees won't be prime. So I'll skip, but over here, just to show you August 3rd, 2 different yards, all green, and then with a bit of yellow in there. So this area here, there's a lot of big gardens, and the yellow, when I checked it, they were all brassicas. So it's probably people letting their lettuces and different things in their gardens flower to collect seeds. So we talk about fat bees. You need pollen and polyfloral pollens to make sure your winter bees are nice and healthy. So I recommend about 60 pounds per brood box minimum, and irrelevant of the location, because the more honey or sugar honey you have in your boxes in the fall, it means you don't have to worry about feeding in the spring. And my bees don't take syrup in the spring, so by having an extra 50 pounds in the spring, it just means I don't need to worry about my bees starving. And sugar syrup, honey is actually, like up here I see it because it's energy intensive, and my bees don't get any cleansing flights from October to sometimes in March, but usually not before mid to late April. So I need really clean honey, or else they poop everywhere and then they get nosema and then the things aren't good. And the nosema doesn't cause dysentery. It's bat stores causes dysentery, and then there's a few sick bees that poop in the hive, and then the bees go and clean in the hive, and then they get sick, and then they start pooping, and then it's a vicious cycle. And honey consumption goes exponential when the bees have severe nosema, because their guts aren't processing the honey. Because they're in competition with the nosema spores in their stomach. Just to show you how long my winter bees have to survive. So I need to make sure they're healthy. They have to live 2/3 of the year or more. And these are all the different reasons why bees don't live long. So this is our job. So in my insulated hive, I don't have to worry about metabolic aging. Even though they have to go, some of them have to go probably 200, 250 days, because at -10 and above, it's almost just resting metabolism that keeps the hive warm. one neat thing about microscopy, and once you start looking at it, you start seeing stuff. And you can look for stuff or you can explore and see what you see. So this was my sample from the 1 yard, and there was all these red pollen balls in there from the collection. And I was like, I thought it, and I was like, there's no lupin in August. So, but then I looked at it and I found this, and I'd seen this in my bee guts with the bees with severe nosema. And then these fried egg things, these are rust spores. Wasn't sure what this was, but I guess it's a winter spore for the rose family. So these cattail things are rust spores. And then fireweed, when it dies after the first big frost, the bees start collecting rust off the leaves like crazy. And it looks like pollen. It's a nice orange colored, almost like hawkweed colored pollen. But from what I've read, it's poor nutrition, and basically the bees aren't getting what they need to raise the winter bees. So I apologize. I might go a bit over the 30 minutes. Just tell me to shut up if you want me to. I have thick skin. Feeding strategy. So first year I recommend up here, because it's all about building wax, is not to be shy with the 1-to-1, because you want those boxes full of wax and full of really thick, nice honey frames. Because a big, nice, thick honey frame is wonderful thermal mass, and it really slows down that heat loss, especially in a wooden hive. In a poly, it's wonderful, but in a wooden hive, you need that thermal mass to help the bees out. If it's too light, then temperature fluctuations will really knock those bees out. So late spring, I'll skip over this, but in the summer, if you start seeing EFB or snot brood, I've had it once or twice up here after some heat and some dry, just adding some feed on it with a couple of pollen patties. Within a week or two, it was gone. And then the queen went back to normal and things went back to normal. So usually up here, these diseases come out after nutritional stressor, and you deal with that, and then the issues go away. And I know some people don't want to feed, but bees aren't native to Canada or the US. So sometimes there are gaps, and if you follow native pollinators, they have very specific I guess life periods, especially bumblebees up here, because they're in a nest, and their nest is at a depth where it'll thaw out when certain things start flowering so that they won't die. And then once those things die out, it's the end of the season. So different species of bumblebees and mason bees and the sweat bees and all that type of stuff up here have some of them have like 1 month life cycles. So, and it's very specific. Just practical application of what honey does in a hive is, if you think about it, in the center frames, a lot of times we get like full brood frames with maybe a bit of honey in the corners. The more you get to the side, the more honey you'll get typically along the edge here. Okay, so yes, it follows the shape of the cluster, but it's also thermodynamics. And that's why typically the side frame here is heavy honey, maybe 3/4 honey, and then it shrinks, is they're doing it on purpose. Or they've evolved to have more honey on the sides than in the middle. And up here, because there's no nectar flow in the fall, as this brood nest empties out, that's where my feed needs to go. So I'm actually I'm timing, I'm trickle feeding my feed so that I don't choke out these brood nests. But then once I know that it's starting to dwindle, I start increasing my feed to then a bulk feed to backfill these brood areas. So just a quick climate, really complicated slide. I'll share the link to the Excel sheet. But basically what I've done is I pull, I think it was because you guys were saying that it's been a bad summer. Like it's almost like growing degree days and cooling degree days and heating degree days, all those terms that we use. I've converted them and I've made them into, I use hourly data. So then I can compare apples to apples. So if I'm looking at your climate versus my climate, where your honey flows, potential honey flows, this blue area is basically the intensity of weather over 8 degrees Celsius. Okay, orange is the intensity of weather over 16 degrees Celsius. This gray area here, that's where the bees are clustered. The bigger it is, the colder it is. Okay, so for example, we get 1200, I call it cluster degree hours. 1200 is minus 40 for 24 hours. So, but this here is probably, it was a cold snap where it probably got down, I think probably minus 10. I'm sure if I checked over here, I could compare. But this is its own presentation. One big thing is, I was impressed. Your big diurnals, I think this was Abbotsford. I was looking for the nearest weather station to your area. And in Abbotsford, August is your biggest diurnal temperatures. Okay, so this is where you need to make sure you have healthy populations to keep that late winter bee brood nest going, because if they get chilled, it means your bees won't actually make the winter. Okay, so it actually probably fits in with some of what you've been observing is, and you can see how you had 30-degree temperature swings in a 24-hour period. So if your population, if it's just a small wooden box, marginal honey, marginal population and too big of a volume, it means that probably you chilled a lot of your brood that was supposed to become your winter bees. Okay, so just something to think about. And then there's these green bars. Those are forage hours. For some reason, your weather station's not pushing out the precipitation. It happens. But if it was, I guess the forage hours would account for it. But you can see that, yeah, last year or this year was actually quite a cool year for you guys. This is how you read the chart. And I can send you the link of the how-to. Pest disease, like I think this chalk brood. I had chalk brood in one hive pretty much the whole summer this year. And I did a good service for a beekeeper in town, and she gave me a box of bees after I helped her split her bees because she had too many. And then the bees that I got back from her within a couple of days developed chalk brood. And it was the first time I took bees from somebody else, and it's probably the last time I'll take bees from somebody else who doesn't understand diseases. Diseases come in cycles. I adapted this from Randy Oliver's stuff. And it's important to understand what your cycles are in your area. And a lot of it has to do with the weather or your forage cycles. And then sometimes there's special triggers in your weather that'll just say, hey, this happened, I have to do this. And that's where these clubs, these groups, if you work together and you start asking these questions, you can actually make this for your area. Nosema, like I was mentioning, I do send samples to the lab in Beaver Lodge. But when I send samples, usually I know there's Nosema, and I'm just looking for the type of Nosema just to make sure it's Serrane or Apis. I've never had Apis up here, so it's always been Serrane. And when I see lots of dead bees and lots of Nosema spores, it typically means it'll make it through till spring, but it'll fail probably mid to late spring. Nothing I can do can bring it back. And the queen and the bees just can't. They're lethargic and they just don't know what they're doing. So, and now it's happened 3 times over the last 7 years. I know the symptoms. I can see it. I did buy a little bottle of fumigillin. I've never used it before. So if I do see it this year, I'll throw a baggie full of fumigillin feed in it in March to see if it makes a difference. But I rather stay away from any antibacterials and antifungals and stuff like that. So that's about it. So I had a few other slides. Yeah, this is a short version. I've got another one. Okay, good. So this is the last slide I'm going to show you. And this is where I'm comparing. This here, the red area is the energy difference required. It's proportional to energy required to heat your hive. So this is a wooden hive, and this is a poly hive. This is your climate. Okay, so this is Abbotsford this year. Okay, you can see that to maintain, so for my area, and once I get this data from the wooden hives, I'll be able to give you a how many degree hours it equates to how many pounds of honey. Okay, so if I go back to that opening slide, you could see that once your brooding starts, the bees need to keep that nest at 35 degrees. So that hive enclosure is what's driving the behaviors or the energy requirements of that hive. Okay, so then your consumption, just for heating, compensating for heat loss, is about 3 pounds a week, just for heat loss. In my polys, it's 0.3 pounds of honey per week for heat loss. Okay, so you can see how I'm not saying go out and buy polys. One beekeeper here, hopefully his thesis goes out. He just wrote his master's thesis on using insulation year round. But one beekeeper, another beekeeper actually kept his insulation on his wooden hives, and he made them modular so it's easy to take off. So now most beekeepers up here keep their insulation on into early June, just to make sure that the nest never gets chilled. And then once we start getting more frost and the colder weather, October, they throw on their insulating shell on their hive, just to make sure that their winter bees don't get chilled. Okay, because that's the risk with a wooden hive, especially if you get a big diurnal, because the bees won't be able to adjust. Okay, so it's about a 5 to 8 hours for a cluster to adjust to say a 20 to 30 degree swing in a wooden hive. And in a poly, it's half an hour to an hour to adjust to that temperature swing. Okay, so just to give you some perspective of what can be going wrong, and thermal stress on a cluster that has to expand and contract, expand and contract, expand and contract every day. And I'll send you a link to one of my videos of that wooden hive that shows the solar effect, because the sun comes out and you can see the cluster heads towards that south wall, hugs the south wall. It creates a condensation point on the north wall, and then the sun sets and then the cluster goes back to the center position. And it's a daily cycle of that cluster moving to the south wall and back and there and back. So it's all things that I guess I question as an engineer. Can we do better? So I'll stop there. And if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Etienne. That was great. I know there are some questions. Let me gather in our where was I reading it? It was you, Heather. Heather, you could probably ask the question as opposed to me finding it and reading it.
Sure. Etienne, I think you mentioned it after I asked the question, but my question was, with your honeydew honey, do your bees experience dysentery from that?
Yes, the first year, or actually maybe 4 years ago, the year I lost all my hives was the year I trialed top entrances for the first time. And the year my hives were chock full of honeydew. And it's the only year I had dysentery. And then the bees were just full of nosema also. So I've had it analyzed now, and the Poles and the Slovaks at Epimondia had a taste of it too, and they said one was spruce honey, and then the other one was they had no idea what it was. So it's a northern Canadian aphid.
Cool. Yeah, I made the mistake years ago of when I saw dysentery splotches inside my hive, I immediately pinned it on nosema, and I learned after the fact that it's not necessarily due to nosema. It could well be what type of forage they're into, specifically, possibly honeydew forage. And
the other one is wet stores. So if the moisture content is too high on your winter stores, the chances are it'll cause dysentery also, because they can't manage their moisture.
Got it. Thanks.
Go ahead, Julia.
Hey, thanks, Elaine. Hi, Etienne. Interesting. I've got a really easy question for you to start. I'm just curious, using your polys all year round, do they chip and get broken by management?
They're actually quite tough. I've had them for 7 years now, and there's a couple times where I've had one squirrel chew the corner on one. But basically I still have the same boxes I had 7 years ago, and I've painted them once, and I haven't had to paint them again. And there's minor dents here and there, but I guess me using tuck tape to tape the seams now to prevent any air leakage inside causes more damage than anything. But it just pulls the paint off.
Okay, may I ask another question now? Here's the real question. So with your poly boxes, because and in the fall, I'm thinking, do you find that you can get away with a smaller population going into winter than you would have to have with a regular box? It's not as well insulated.
Yes. So before I figured out the fall nutrition, and making sure I had really healthy winter bees, I had okay clusters, but they were a lot smaller than what they are now, and they do fine. And I'd say Derek Mitchell put out a really interesting paper a few years back, and he calls it like mass to thermal conductance ratio. So basically it's the mass of bees to the thermal conductance of the hive is the critical factor for bee survival over winter. So basically that's why and I'm doing some numbers right now in ventilation, is in a hive, the reason you want a big cluster, the bigger your cluster is, the less convective flow you'll have in your hive. Convective heat transfer is higher than conductive. So the cluster's more able to manage and control their heat if they're clustered in a wooden hive, because they have to cluster because the enclosure can't retain any heat. In a poly hive, basically, especially without a top entrance, the only place you lose heat is via your bottom entrance. And it almost seems, I just took some IR photography of my cluster, and it almost seems like they heat the cluster from below because heat rises, and then it goes up. And I'll probably have to do a technical talk at some point, because even disturbing my hives, so because I've been doing some checks and some tests over winter, and every time I go and do something to the hive, I've noticed heat spikes that last about 3 days. And a couple days ago, I had I was like, because I'm estimating what my metabolic rate is and my heat loss and all that. And what it was is it's actually the thermal gain of the honey and the superorganisms. So the bees, because there's no heat loss, the heat loss is 3 watts per hour, but the gain was 176 over 10 hours. So it's actually 40 to 50 hours to lose that extra heat that they gained.
Oh my God, you're such a numbers guy.
But in a wooden hive with a top entrance and all that extra ventilation we tend to put, that would be gone within hours.
Yeah.
It would just flow out. So that's why disturbances in a polyhive seem longer, that's my hypothesis, than in a wooden hive.
Okay, that was too
Sorry
many
for that.
Yeah, too many numbers for me, so I don't understand what you said. But I will ask Heather later, and we'll have a discussion about it, Heather. Okay, did you understand what he said, Heather? She's not admitting anything. I just...
So Etienne, why is it such a bad thing to have an increase in temperature and heat in a polystyrene hive?
Oh, it's not bad. I thought it was bad because I thought they were consuming more honey.
Yeah.
But it's actually the heat just being captured within the within the honey and the bees itself, and just taking longer to dissipate.
Right.
So the net difference is the same. So they wasted basically they over generated 150 watts of energy versus their typical 10. But the good thing is that heat loss, that heat is actually retained, so it's not lost. But in a wooden hive, it would be lost to the environment.
So based on that heat that they're retaining for an extended period of time in a polystyrene hive, then they basically wouldn't have to eat for the next 6 or 10 hours or use up honey for the next number of hours because they're already nice and toasty warm.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, now I'm with you guys. So those bees in the oh, sorry, Elaine, can I ask another question?
Oh, you go.
So those bees who are in the poly box, another way to put it is they're way more relaxed. They don't have to be in that tight cluster.
Exactly. So I've done the numbers, and like basically at -10, they have to start to shiver.
Yeah.
Warmer than -10, just their resting metabolism is enough to keep them warm to a decent temperature.
That's right. So that's why in the poly, even though when you look at them late fall and they're not in a tight cluster, you don't have to worry because you might tend to think, oh God, they're going to eat all their food. In fact, they don't eat more food because they really can just relax and just slow down completely and not need more energy.
Because I've read a ton of papers now and studies, and all the studies like Southwick and all these famous people, they were all done in wooden hives on the cluster.
Yeah.
And the enclosure, they always assume the temperature outside is equal to the temperature inside. And they never get the benefit of being protected by that extra enclosure. And in Alberta, they did some studies in the 80s, early 80s, late 70s. But it's black box studies that just measures what. And they took the odd temperature here and there. And I think Paul, your bee person, was part of that project. So they took a bunch of temperatures inside the hive, but it was only a what study. When I say what is, they're not trying to understand why or the mechanism. And that's what drives me is I want to know why. And I don't care what the right answer is or if there's a right or a wrong. I just want to know why. And it drives people nuts. But and that's why wood is okay, poly's okay, but I think there's applications. I know I got an email from somebody on the island who started using poly nooks, and he's 2 years in using poly nooks now, and he's like, wow, because he just says the brood nest in that poly nook is just a lot easier to control and maintain and to grow because they don't have to deal with that heat loss. If I just go really quick, I think
So can you do that and answer a question? Right? Can you do things at once, Etienne?
Absolutely.
So, but I can't because now I forgot my question. Shit. It was, oh yeah. So, you know, so a number of us here use that blue insulator, 1-inch insulation around our colonies. Have you got any information on how efficient that is compared to actual poly box? Because I was just looking at the cost of getting poly boxes and I didn't have the money, so I use that instead.
So I'll reshare my screen if that's okay.
Thank you for answering all my questions, by the way.
No worries. So let me know when you see my screen.
It says it's starting to share your screen, so it's coming. There it is.
Oh
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, great, great.
So this beekeeper here,
Yeah.
He's got 5 hives, and he's had 5 hives for the last 6 years, 7 years, and he's never lost one. And he's really good at requeening. He manages his mites wonderfully. He feeds when he has to. He does pollen patties when he has to. So he's like the perfect beekeeper. And he uses a top entrance. So the key with a top entrance, if you're going to use one, is make sure you've got a nice constrained lower entrance. And when I talk about top entrances, I said that's the key, is if your bottom entrance is too big, you're going to lose too much heat out the top. So it's managing that lower entrance and direct wind flow. The insulation properties of this is R10, which is better than my poly box. So if I just go back, yeah, so this is my setup right now. And basically, this is a new setup. This is my base with my crawl space underneath that my open screen boards go into. So I'll just put the pointer. So my screen bottom boards open up into this cavity below here. And you can see it's just full of snow now. So there's no drafts, there's nothing going underneath. And what I do is I add 2-inch and 2-inch on the outside perimeters. And just this foil, bubble foil wrap, it's just to create a dead air space to prevent the wind from blowing in. I don't use top entrances and we get snow and stuff here. So I use pieces of plywood to keep the bottom entrance protected from snow, from the wind. And basically the bees, when they die, they just hit this board and land on my little, I've got a little board in front of each hive, and then the dead bees land on here. And that's how I measure my mortality, is the bees can't go anywhere, so they just die in front of the hive. And I run a lot of them 9 frames. And the one thing with polys is it doesn't absorb any moisture. So I just took 1x10s and I notched them to make them the same size as a frame. And I put them on the outsides. I'll probably plane it down to a 1/2 inch versus the 3/4 inch, and then it'll leave a bit more space. And I want to scratch it up to give because they don't like propolizing these flat poly surfaces, but now it'll give me a nice surface that the bees can propolize. And basically I can pull it out, change it if I have to, and it's a nice replaceable thing. But I'd say if you go, I'll just go down. If you go this route, this is fine. It's actually better than my setup. And he doesn't add anything else. And he does fine at -40. So, and what I was going to show you is this.
Do you put a candy board on your bees? Do you put anything for emergency?
I did. And right now, let's see, do I have it anywhere? I don't have it here. But basically, it's more, so underneath here, I do have some wood dust or some chicken wood shavings, and I have an open slot in the middle here that lets me, oh, actually it's right here. So it's about 2 inches high, and I use extra mediums to really beef up my top insulation. I just put these insulation, this board, 4 inches of board on top of this, And this middle slot here is where I put my pollen patties in March. So it lets me open up the hive without letting too much heat out,
Yeah.
and without disturbing them too much. So I can throw a feed bag in there and some pollen patties, and then just close it back up, and they're good for another month.
Nice. Thank you.
No worries. So the thing I wanted to show you about this heat stuff is, it's actually the guy from Broodminder. He did a bunch of monitoring a while back, but he didn't really analyze his data. And I convinced him to give me his data. And it was from a few years back. And this is where the brood starts. And this is honey equivalent. So it's pounds of honey per week. And you can see that over here, the cluster is clustered, it's tight. So the main mechanism is this meta curve. So basically it's the cluster is its principal means of survival. And then once the brood starts, now the enclosure becomes its means of survival. So it has to maintain the temperature inside that enclosure at 35 degrees Celsius. So that's why the honey consumption jumps, is because it goes from losing a couple of watts per week, or sorry, per hour, to losing, I don't know, 35 to 50 watts per hour. And that's a lot of energy that they're burning to try to keep warm. And this is when they have the lowest store levels. So then they don't have that thermal mass really to help with the temperature swings. And this is when most hives starve or die. Is, I have a feeling a lot of times they say starve, or they couldn't reach the honey. It's just, it's temperature swings. And if they can't manage those temperature swings, then that's what really hurts them.
Are there no more questions? I have more questions.
Sure, I've got time.
Am I allowed to ask more questions?
Oh, just one reason why I think there's not many Yukoners is we didn't change our time this year. So I called in an hour early, and I said, oh shoot, BC's an hour ahead of us, or behind us now. So yeah, so that's
didn't even think of that.
Etienne, do you use any other nutrient supplements except for pollen patty?
Sugar syrup, I do use Hive Alive. I used to use Honeybee Healthy, but it's more of a stimulant. If the bees are hungry, they'll eat. But I like what's in Hive Alive, the thymol and some of the extracts that they have in there. And I tend to, so in the fall and in the spring, I'll do a treatment of Hive Alive, and I'll give a good quantity. And I've never ran half my hives with and the other half without to see what the difference is. But I guess, knock on wood, I'm doing better than what I used to. So I've always made it through the winter, but now I'm making it through the winter, and I'm splitting hives in May. And
do you do equal amount of pollen in the fall and in the spring, or do you have a different amount of pollen depending if it's the beginning or the end?
Oh, he's back.
Well, welcome back, Etienne. He's muted still.
Yeah, we just had a power bump, so everything just went black, and we're back now.
Dare I ask a question again?
About the the pollen patty.
Yeah.
I remembered. It's in the spring. It's usually about a half pollen patty early March to get things going, and then it's as required. So as long as they're taking it down, I keep adding a half. If they stop taking it and the fresh pollen starts coming in, then I just stop. And then occasionally, if there's a dearth or something, I might put a half on. I rarely put a full pound patty on a hive. and in the fall now, because I don't want to go in and out of those hives, I tend to just put a pound patty late July, early August, and I might do max 2 pounds. So 2 patties. So I don't put that much. So it's like this year, usually we get a lot of natural pollen, and it's just the pollen flows are massive. In June, I'm talking to myself.
Diversity.
He starts later in the spring than we do. We usually start mid-February with pollen. And because his temperatures are lower, I guess that's why he's starting.
Back. I can see him moving. He's back.
Oh,
I guess I was talking to myself. I was like, nobody's faces were moving. Everybody was in a pause. I was like, what's going on?
So you were just about to talk about the natural pollen in your area.
Yeah, so usually first pollen is late April in May. And then from mid-May, it just explodes. There's willows and stuff everywhere here. It just goes crazy. And then pretty much lasts till early to mid-July, where we have lots of variety, beautiful colors coming in and quantities. And then it's just fireweed. And then if there's non-natives like clovers and hawkweed and stuff like that, they'll keep pushing it out. And in this yard at my home location is pure boreal forest with very few non-natives. And basically mine's a true Yukon cycle. So basically and I know what the bumblebees have to go through, by early August, there's nothing. There's the odd hawkweed here and there, but nothing to sustain. And that's where if I had the chart this year, I charted the brood cycle of my 3 yards, and the one in town was going still in early September. There was still fresh pollen in there. So I've learned to just observe the hive, and I recognize the orange from a flower and the orange from rust now.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm curious, would we have that rust problem here as well? I've never heard of that. I know plants that get rust. I have them in my garden, but I never occurred to me that bees would be interested in that. Are they interested in that in the Yukon because there's nothing else?
That's what I think. I think if they'll take whatever's available because there's nothing else out there. But I know Randy Oliver, because on his website, that's where I got a lot of my information, is he has a dearth in August, and his bees pack it in that orange fake pollen, rust pollen, and they bring it in. So his remedy was to feed pollen patties to get his bees over that hump. And he shows, if you go to his website there, he shows frames of it. So I think it might be regional. And rural areas may have bigger problems than urban areas, especially if there's no farming around or those nice verges.
So are there any other questions from any of our participants here? Oh, Maggie has a question. You got to unmute yourself, Maggie.
Okay. Many years ago, when we kept bees in Manitoba, I was always impressed with the honeydew. I'm kind of interested in what you said about honeydew honey, and it's linked with dysentery. So when we did get the honeydew honey, so to speak, the ladies in the community, especially the Ukrainian ladies, they wanted the honeydew honey from us because they had a special bread or food that they made. Has anybody heard of any of that before? It was kind of interesting. Yeah, but anyway, the ladies would come and want our honeydew honey. All right. I think they were the Ukrainians, so it was interesting. I hadn't associated honeydew honey with dysentery before, so it was interesting. Yeah.
So I guess it's the ash content. So they call it ash, like the non-digestibles in the honeydew is higher than a blossom honey.
Okay.
And it means that their gut, as they're consuming it over winter, and they can't go cleanse, accumulates faster than if they were just eating a pure carbohydrate type honey or a sugar syrup honey. So, and I guess Rusty says 30% of the bee can hold 30% to 40% of their weight in fecal matter. And then at that point, they can't hold it in anymore and they have to let it go. And if it's cold outside, they're doing it inside.
Yeah, yeah. When you say ash content, excuse my ignorance, do you mean ash the tree?
No, it's non-digestibles. It's I just got the Eva Crane honey book there and starting to read on it. But the ash is just non-digestibles. It's particles in the honey.
All right.
Okay. From it, like dust particles or something that the bees and animals can't digest.
Okay. All right. Oh, very interesting. Okay. Thank you.
This has been most interesting, Etienne. I realize our time has run quite long here. I appreciate you hanging around for so long and answering questions, and the discussion has been very interesting.